Today we're going to talk about the collapse of the Eastern Front as the Soviet Army regains ground which they lost when the Germans began Operation Barbarossa. This was a fearsome theater of the war, and after 1942 we saw the Germans collapse, especially after their defeat at Stalingrad, and then again after their defeat at the Battle of Kursk, their last offensive in the east. The German strategy was to try to contain the spread of the Soviet army, try to hold them off at several different rivers, all to no avail. In this time period, we see just how terrifying the combat between two totalitarian states can be, especially when we see the true nature of the Nazi Party revealed in its destruction, both here in the collapse of the Eastern Front and then later on as we talk about the fall of Berlin itself. Extremely vicious fighting and extreme loss of life for civilians as we examine the final collapse of the Eastern Front. From the north to the south of the Eastern Front, in 1943 through 1945, the Germans begin to collapse in the face of renewed Russian offensives. The Russians were supported by equipment through Lend-Lease programs provided by the United States and other allies. In particular, the United States provided thousands upon thousands of trucks, even tanks and aircraft, as well as food, especially canned goods, which helped supply the Russian forces forward. The Russians were also motivated by enormous propaganda and a sense that they had failed the motherland as they had allowed the German invasion in 1941. This sense of failure was probably unfair. A lot of the failure really was the result of poor leadership on the part of the Soviet government. However, their propaganda convinced many of the soldiers that it was their fault, and so ensued a desperate fight for revenge as the Russian soldiers began to overrun German defenses through 1945. Ultimately, in 1945, Germany will surrender after Berlin is taken. But here we're just going to start by looking at the Eastern Front before Berlin and its collapse. In this map, you can see sort of the phases of the collapse. Ultimately, Germany is going to lose what they had gained in Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and then some of the territory that is part of Germany before the war, Prussia, also known as Pomerania. The Russian forces in the area where we will focus were commanded by Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov and Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky. These were incredibly tough Russian generals. Rokossovsky in particular is interesting. He was actually born Polish, although at the time he was born it was still kind of part of the Russian Empire, and he became an officer in the Russian army. However, in 1937, as Stalin was purging officers from the military, he had been accused of betraying the Soviet Union in various ways, never confessed, even though he was tortured. He had fingernails pulled out, he was beaten up, he had 9 of his front teeth removed, and then later those were replaced with stainless steel dentures. So this was a Russian general who literally had steel teeth, and he was relentless. Stalin used to play off these two in particular, trying to get them to compete to take ground the fastest. Stalin had, as Hitler did, a fondness for playing off his subordinates and rivalries against each other. Accompanying the Russian main forces were the forces of the dreaded NKVD, which is the sort of political wing of the Russian military. And they worked in close cooperation with Smersh, which was the Russian military intelligence. Both of these organizations were ultimately led by Beria, who was the head of Soviet security. He was a profoundly cruel man who was very fond of torture, took advantage of lots of his victims, sent thousands and thousands of people to their deaths or to prison. Ironically, and probably with poetic justice, later on, shortly after the death of Stalin in the 1950s, he was himself accused of crimes by the next Soviet leaders, many of whom remembered his cruelty and probably had feared him greatly before Stalin's death, and he himself was tortured and put to death. But these forces were right with the Soviet forces as they began to take ground back from the Germans, and were very interested in capturing any type of intelligence, any equipment, but also in ensuring a high level of terror and motivation among the Soviet forces going into Germany. So the push into Germany through Poland was focused on several major river crossings. You can see the first river there is the Vistula. That river actually goes right through the city of Warsaw in central Poland, coming out just by Danzig in the north. You can just sort of see it. And then the Oder-Neisse rivers, which kind of form the traditional border between Germany and Poland. In the north, as you can see, the Second White Russian Army led by Rokossovsky, and then a little bit farther south you have the First White Russian Army commanded by Zhukov. Those are the two we'll think more about. And then below that, Konev with the Ukrainian front, and he is going to clean up what the Germans had taken farther south. So the Germans tried to mount defenses on these two river points. First, the Vistula, and if you think about rivers, they are pretty good strategic defense opportunities, because if you could destroy bridges or control bridges, it's a really significant logistical challenge for a large army to cross. So they mounted defenses at both these points, ultimately unsuccessful. You can see, though, sections of Prussia are on the Russian side of the Vistula River. These had been traditionally German territories, culturally German for centuries, and they are going to be overrun by the oncoming Russian forces. The Germans were beginning to reach into their last-ditch defense strategies. This included the formation of what was called the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, or an army made up of old men and young boys, given whatever weapons were still available. In many cases, old men who were veterans of the First World War were given weapons. Even some women were trained in the use of weapons. So on the right we can see a civilian woman being trained in the use of a Panzerfaust, which is basically an early anti-tank rocket launcher, single-shot weapon. They were very effective, but you really don't want to give civilians this kind of weaponry. Even worse than this, the Hitler Youth, or Hitlerjungen, was militarized, so that by 1945, actually even before that in some cases, it was common for boys as young as 12 to be in combat. In Berlin in particular, a number of groups of boys were put in charge of flak batteries, and there's gruesome tales of entire groups of children being wiped out as these flak batteries were targeted by Allied aircraft. In ground combat, they were used to defend against the Red Army, both in these riverfront battles, but then ultimately in the battle for Berlin itself. Normal soldiers were issued things like cigarettes as part of their regular kit and ration. For these young boys, they switched that out for chocolate. It's a bad sign when your soldiers require chocolate to fight because they're 12 years old. Many of these children were captured, the lucky ones captured by American and British forces, but some did fight to the death, putting their lives down for the sake of Adolf Hitler, who had no problem with sacrificing children in a losing battle with the Russians. So one of the first major cities of importance to fall in East Prussia was Königsberg, the traditional capital of this region. The Russians attacked and overran Königsberg with severe consequences to the civilian population. You can see here some of the wreckage in the city. There's a destroyed assault vehicle, a mangled horse, and then on the right some pictures of German soldiers being held as captives there by that. There's the Russian soldier with a gun. Most of these German soldiers would be marched into Soviet captivity, there to stay for decades. Many would never return. This is an eyewitness account from, I believe, a captured soldier who is ultimately being marched out of Königsberg. He says, "We marched on. We saw scenes that cannot be described. The ditches by the sides of the streets were full of corpses, many of them clearly showing signs of unbelievable maltreatment and rape. Dead children lay around in great numbers. Bodies hung from the trees, their watches cut off." Looting was a significant issue. German women were led in all directions. Drunken Russians flogged a German nun. An elderly woman sat by the side of the road, both her legs having been crushed by vehicles. Farmsteads burned, the household belongings lying in the roads. Cows ran across the countryside and were indiscriminately shot and left lying. Many accounts describe the psychological state of Russian soldiers, who were often supplied with enormous amounts of alcohol to keep them willing to fight. The Russian soldiers were shocked and appalled at the comparative level of affluence they saw in German farms and homes as they entered East and then West Prussia. They were shocked that a people as well off as the Germans, with nice houses, plenty of food, would ever consider it necessary to invade the Soviet Union. And this absolutely made them mad with rage. There are accounts of Russians destroying every piece of glass, windows, mirrors that they could find. What they couldn't destroy or what they couldn't carry, they destroyed. They were allowed to ship parcels of several kilograms home that were filled with anything they could carry from the civilian population. Here you see refugees fleeing from Danzig on the other side of the Vistula River. They were called Flüchtlingsstreck, refugees. So the next major city to fall was Danzig, and this opened up the suffering in West Prussia. Here's some shop windows in Danzig. First window instructs people to watch out for any soldiers who might be trying to flee with refugees. They would be considered deserters, and the penalty for that would be death. Many were killed or hung, often hung in conspicuous places with signs describing them as cowards and traitors to the German people. And then on the other side, an order telling the citizens of Danzigers, to avoid panic or spreading rumors, because this will only help the Bolsheviks. This account comes from the book The Fall of Berlin, 1945, which I've used to help prepare this lecture and other lectures. This author has done a lot of good work that I've found helpful and interesting studying different parts of this war. But this is a section where he describes some of the accounts of suffering of civilians in Danzig, and they're very disturbing. He writes, "Young women, desperate to escape the notice of soldiers, rubbed wood ash and soot into their faces. They tried peasant handkerchiefs low on their brow, bundled themselves up to hide their figures, and hobbled along the roadside like ancient crones. Yet this concealment of youth was no automatic safeguard. Many elderly women were raped as well. German women developed their own verbal formulae for what they had been through. Many used to say, 'I had to concede.' One recounted that she had to concede 13 times. Her horror seemed to contain a touch of pride at what she had endured, the Busa von Olderhausen noted with surprise. But far more women were traumatized by their terrible experiences. Some became catatonic, others committed suicide. But as with Busa von Olderhausen, pregnant women usually rejected this escape route, and instinctive duty to their unborn children became paramount. Many Pomeranians were murdered in the first week of occupation. Near the village, an elderly couple was chased into icy waters of the village pond, where they died. A man was harnessed to a plow, which he was forced to drag until he collapsed. This is only some of the stories that are recorded in this book, and with many accounts, the Russian propaganda described Germany as the blonde witch, which seems to have inspired the Russian soldiers in their maltreatment of women. A report sent to Russian intelligence, to Smersh, indicates that virtually every woman who stayed in Prussia was probably assaulted and raped by Russian soldiers. Many of them were then killed directly afterwards. A lot of Russian veterans after the war were reluctant to talk about it, but there are some who saw it, who will still speak openly about this as fair treatment considering what the Germans had done to the Russian population, and spoke of how millions of their children were born to German women in the wake of this invasion. One of the most upsetting incidents took place in January of 1945 with the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. This was a large cruise ship, and it initially had been a very important or, famous cruise ship built in Germany before the war. In 1945, in January, Danzig had been largely cut off. It's on the sea, and so the only escape route for people in that area was through the Baltic Sea. As a result, this ship, harbored at Danzig, was filled with over 10,000 refugees. On January 30th, 1945, a Russian submarine operating in the Baltic with the mission of sinking transport ships supplying the German forces in the area sighted this ship and fired 3 torpedoes, causing it to sink. Of the 10,000 plus refugees on board, over 9,000 died in the icy waters of the Baltic. Over half of those, over 5,000, were children. This is, to this day, the most significant loss of life in a maritime catastrophe in known history. No other death count from a ship sinking really comes close to the 9,000 plus that were killed. Very few survived. The sinking of this ship is a good symbol for the collapse of the Eastern Front, something that happened as an inevitable consequence of the conflict with the Soviet Union, and which took the lives of thousands and thousands of civilians caught up in the collapse of the Third Reich.